Hello everyone, welcome to my session Unleashing the Potential of Hybrid Cloud, Streamlining Multi-Cloud Management and On-Premise Integration. I know the title is quite a handful, but I hope at the end of the session everything makes sense. Before I start, a couple sentences about myself. My name is Wolfgang Ofner. I'm a freelance cloud architect. I'm currently located in Perth, Australia, but for around the last 6 years I lived in Switzerland and I still work for Swiss clients. My focus is on Microsoft technologies such as Azure and .NET, and I specialize on Kubernetes and DevOps. If you have any questions or want to contact me, feel free to message me on my blog or via LinkedIn and Twitter. So today I want to talk about what hybrid cloud is. Then I want to talk about Azure Arc and Kubernetes. Then I'm going to give some examples how you can integrate your on-premise infrastructure with the cloud. I'm going to talk about 2 real-world examples I worked on, and at the end I give you my opinion of hybrid cloud. So, what is hybrid cloud? The definition I found on Wikipedia is hybrid cloud is a combination of public and private cloud services, along with on-premise infrastructure, creating a unified computing environment that offers great flexibility, scalability, and cost-effectiveness. In simple terms, hybrid cloud is a mix of your on-premise infrastructure and cloud services. And there are different types of hybrid cloud. The first one would be you split the cloud usage and the on-premise usage. For example, your old legacy software runs on your on-premise data center and the new software will run in the cloud, and they don't talk to each other. It's not really hybrid cloud, in my opinion, but you kind of can name it hybrid cloud. Then the second type would be that you extend your existing on-premise solutions with cloud services. This could be using a storage account, a database, and often you have a VPN connection or an express route connection to the cloud. An express route is a private connection, so it doesn't go over the internet, and it's very fast and secure. This is more hybrid cloud, but you don't gain much. Like if I have my on-premise application and use a database in the cloud, yeah, I can use a Microsoft managed database, for example, but I have latency and I have many problems with this. So that's also not the greatest hybrid cloud solution. So to me, hybrid cloud means unify on-premise and the cloud environment. So this means that you can run cloud services on your on-premise infrastructure. And when you do this, there are some benefits with hybrid cloud. The first one is, especially in Europe, with the data protection laws, the data sovereignty. You always know where your data resides and it will never leave your data center. So you don't have to worry that someone else might be able to access your data. The next reason is security. Again, your data stays on-premise, so that's the first thing, but also the cloud providers such as Microsoft invest billions every year into best practices for security. So why not use them when they already spend so much money? The third advantage is, since everything runs on-premise, you have very low to no latency. No matter how great your internet connection is, there's always some latency if you use cloud services, but if it's on-premise, there's almost none. And another big benefit is cost. As always, if you already have infrastructure on-premise, you don't have any additional costs running services there. And why not use the infrastructure you already have instead of running everything in the cloud? And the last benefit I want to talk about is resilience. So when you have a mix of cloud and on-premise services, you can build great solutions that will be always running. So for example, if your on-premise data center fails, you can switch to a cloud data center and the other way around. But as always, there are some challenges. And a big challenge of hybrid cloud is that it can become very complicated very quickly. So if you run your software on-premise, you have to know how to manage your on-premise infrastructure, your data center, data access, and so on. If you run it in the cloud, it's the same. You have to manage it there. You use probably different tools, and if you combine them, suddenly you just have to know everything from both worlds. I said security is an advantage, but it can also be a disadvantage. Suddenly you have so many possibilities of services and tools. They're great to use, but can also be hard to manage and to keep secure if you don't really know what you're doing. Then the next one is data integration, because you have the options to use cloud services for your data, but you have to know where your data resides. And as I said, in Europe, with the data protection laws, you want to make sure that the data never leaves your data center. And if it does, you always want to know who can access the data. And also, if you use different services, for example, a SQL database and a NoSQL database, you have to make sure that you sync them up and that you send the data correctly from one database to the other one. And the biggest problem I've experienced is the skill set. Many administrators know how to run the data center on-premise, or they know how to run it in the cloud. But when you have to do both, there's so many skills involved that can be quite a big challenge to get started. And with hybrid cloud, as I said, it's very complicated, but Microsoft offers several services to get started with hybrid cloud. There are 3 hardware solutions. They're called Azure Stack Edge, Azure Stack Hub, and Azure Stack HCI, and they help you to run Microsoft services on your on-premise infrastructure. The first one, Azure Stack Edge, as the name suggests, is for edge solutions. So for example, if you have many IoT devices and want to send data to the cloud, you can first send it to the Azure Stack Edge device, and you can filter the data, or you can already use Azure Machine Learning and can process the data before you can send it to the cloud. This can help you to save a lot of costs and also don't send everything, so you only send what you need. The second one, Azure Stack Hub, allows you to run an Azure data center in your own infrastructure. It's only a subset of Azure services, but the most important ones like Azure App Service, Azure Kubernetes Service, or databases are included. So if you have the requirement to run on-premise but still want to use Azure services, this might be a great fit. But what I want to focus today is the Azure Stack HCI. And with this, there's also a software solution that's called Azure Arc. And I also want to talk about Azure Arc later. And what this service does, it allows you to manage your on-premise infrastructure with Azure. As I said before, I want to focus on Azure Stack HCI, and what this is, it's a variant of the Windows Server operating system, and it also brings a lot of technologies Microsoft is already using in the Azure cloud platform, such as Hyper-V or software-defined networking. And with Azure Stack HCI, you can build your own cluster, and these clusters are small, so they could be one physical server, but they can also get quite big, actually up to 16 physical server. So you can use whatever requirement you have. And Azure Stack HCI is delivered as an Azure service. This means that you can see what's going on in your Azure subscription, and you can also use Azure services such as site recovery, monitoring, or creating backups. And the biggest advantage, in my opinion, of Azure Stack HCI is that you can use it in a disconnected scenario. This means, for example, if you have an airplane or a cruise ship, and if you take the example of the cruise ship, it has an internet connection when it's in the harbor, so you can deploy a new application, run the software as if it was in Azure, and once the cruise ship leaves the harbor, the internet connection will be lost, but the services continue running. And that's what the customers expect. They expect that the entertainment is working, that they can play in the casino, and that they can pay their restaurant bills with credit cards. And once the cruise ship is back in the harbor, the internet connection will be back, and then the developers can deploy new software if needed. Here we have an overview how Azure Stack HCI works. So on the bottom, we have the operating system. Then we have the Hyper-V or software-defined networking, and then we have virtual machines. They can be Windows servers or Linux server, And what's the most interesting part is you can also run Azure Kubernetes service. And this allows you to run an Azure managed Kubernetes cluster on your on-premise infrastructure. And all of this is managed via Azure Arc. That's running as a service in Azure. And we'll talk about this in a couple minutes, how Azure Arc manages your infrastructure and how it's also helping you to bring Azure Service to your on-premise data center. Here you can see a decision matrix that's provided by Microsoft, which will help you to find the right solution for a multi-cloud environment as well as a hybrid cloud environment. For example, if you have to find a solution for a multi-cloud environment, you will probably end up with an Azure Arc solution. And I don't want to go into the details today. I just want you to know that this exists in case you have to find a solution in a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud environment. So next up, I want to talk about Azure Arc. Azure Arc is an Azure service, which is in my opinion the most powerful service today. And what it does, it allows you to manage your infrastructure that's running outside of Azure with Azure services. And outside of Azure means it can run on-premise, but also with different cloud providers such as Google or AWS. And the way you can manage this is that Azure Arc projects your infrastructure inside Azure. So it looks like if it's running in Azure. And you can manage Linux and Windows VMs, as well as bare metal server. You can also manage any Cloud Native Computing Foundation certified Kubernetes distribution, which is almost every used Kubernetes distribution, and also a SQL Server. And if you go to the Azure portal and open the Azure Arc service, you can see on the left side all the services or infrastructure you can manage. As I said, for example, if you have a Kubernetes cluster, but you also have VMware and Postgres. So there are many services, and as you can see, some of them are still in preview, but this is because there are new services coming every couple of weeks. And since it looks like that the infrastructure is running in Azure, this means that you can also use the tools from Azure to manage them. If you have VMs, this could be the update management. So you can, for example, say, I want to update Windows updates on all my Windows servers today at 2 a.m. Then you can use configuration management to manage the VMs, and you can also use Azure services such as the Microsoft Cloud Defender. An even better usage of Azure Arc is the so-called Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. And this allows you to install Azure Arc inside your Kubernetes cluster and then use Azure Arc extensions to bring Azure services to your Kubernetes cluster. And these Azure services could be, for example, Azure Monitor, Azure Policies, or using the Azure Key Vault as your secrets provider. And another great feature is that it allows you to securely connect to your Kubernetes cluster, even if you don't have any open ports for an inbound connection. To install Azure Arc, you only have to have the Azure CLI installed and the Azure Arc CLI extension. You can install both with a single line command. And once you have this, you also have to register certain Azure provider. You only have to do this once per subscription. And you can see here the commands. Again, it's a one line command per provider. And if you do this the first time, it can take up to 10 minutes. And after that, you can check if that they are installed. You have to make sure that the state is registered. And once you have done this, you can install Azure Arc with a single CLI command in your Azure Kubernetes cluster. All you have to do is the Azure CLI keyword, that's AC connected K8S connect. Then you provide a name, in this case K3S Arc, and in what resource group you want to install it. So I use the resource group Arc Demo. And that's gonna take a couple minutes. And what's happening in the background is that Azure Arc will use some Helm charts to install 10 different applications in the Azure Arc namespace. So after 5 to 10 minutes, if you check the Azure Arc namespace, you will see all your applications running there. And the names already indicate what they are doing. For example, here you have an extension manager. This one is used to manage the extensions. You have a matrix agent, so you can connect or you can see some metric information. And here you have another application that allows you to connect to the Kubernetes cluster. As I said before, you can see with Azure Arc in the Azure portal all the infrastructure that's running outside of Azure. That's a so-called single pane of glass. And the big advantage is that you can use one tool to manage everything, no matter where it runs. If it runs on Azure, on-premise, with AWS, it doesn't matter. You have one dashboard and you can manage everything there. And if you go back to the Azure portal, we can see on the left side all the services, and if you click on Kubernetes cluster, you can see that I have 2 Kubernetes clusters managed right now. And you can also see some information, for example, that the version 1.23.12 is running on this Kubernetes cluster right now. And if you click on this cluster, you can see on the left side that the menu looks almost the same as if you were using the Azure Kubernetes service. So if you know AKS, it will be very easy for you to get used to it. And as you can see in the screenshot, the only difference is if you click here on the left on the Kubernetes resources, for example on namespace, you don't see immediately what's running inside the Kubernetes cluster. That's just an additional security feature, and you have to first create a token and then use this token to authenticate. And then you see everything that's running inside the cluster. So now the great features about Azure Arc, the Azure Arc extensions. What these extensions do is they allow you to run Azure services inside your Kubernetes cluster. For example, you can use the Azure Arc Git Ops Extension to have deployments, even though your Azure DevOps server or GitHub don't have access to the Kubernetes cluster. Then I'm going to show you how to use Azure Monitor to monitor what's going on in your cluster and with your container. And you can also use the Azure Key Vault secrets provider to have the secrets inside your Azure Key Vault synchronized to the Kubernetes cluster. And what's great about these extensions, they can all be installed via the Azure portal or Azure CLI. And via Azure CLI, it's one simple command, which I will show you in a second. And for the GitOps extension, Microsoft is using Flux as the GitOps agent, which is one of 2 big open source GitOps provider. The second one would be Argo CD. And if you use GitOps, what's a best practice is that you use 2 repositories. The first one is what you probably already have, the application repository. So you have your code there, your unit tests, your pipelines. And then you also have a second one. The second repository will have the configuration. This could be YAML files or probably Helm charts. And these Helm charts describe how you want to deploy the application. And here we can see this. So you hopefully have for your application repository pull requests, and there you have a pipeline that checks that everything in the pull request is working as expected. And once the pull request is approved, then you will have a CI pipeline. This CI pipeline will run some unit tests, but it will also create the Docker image and push the Docker image to the container registry. And after this, you have the CD pipeline. This pipeline can be triggered manually or automatically or whatever you need. And what this pipeline does is it changes the state of the configuration. In the simplest case, it can just update the tag version to the newest tag and then commits these changes in the second repository, the so-called GitOps repository. And the Flux agent, which is running inside the Kubernetes cluster, is checking this GitOps repository if there are any changes. And since the pipeline created a commit, something has changed and the Flux operator sees this, so it downloads these changes and applies them to the Kubernetes cluster. And if the changes are install a new image, the Kubernetes cluster pulls the image from the container registry and runs them. And with this approach, you can create an automated deployment without having an access to the Kubernetes cluster. As said before, you can use a single CLI command to install the extension. And here we have the command. So with all CLI commands, they start with AAC, then what you want to do, in this case K8s configuration, and what operation you want to do, create. And then the parameters are quite easy to identify what they're doing. So for example, you provide a name, then on what cluster you want to install it, in which source group it's running, on what's the repository of your Git Ops operation, and you can also provide some parameter. For example, I have here the git poll interval as 1 minute. This means that the operator is checking every minute if there are any changes. Then you can also provide the branch. In this case, it's the master branch, and then a specific folder. So the operator is only checking the Azure Arc demo folder. And then at the end here, I configured Helm to use Helm version 3. This is gonna take 1 or 2 minutes to install, and after that you can see it in the Azure portal. If you go to the Azure Arc instance, you can see the GitOps operator there. And if you click on this operator, you can see the same information we provided when we installed it. So we have here, for example, the same namespace and also the polling interval. And what's also interesting is here at the bottom, we see a public SSH key. And this SSH key is necessary if you want to access a private Git repository. For example, if I have an Azure DevOps Git repository, which is usually private, you have to put this SSH key into a user profile. And once you have done this, the GitOps agent has access to the same repositories as these users. And this allows the agent to access private repositories in a secure way. And after you did this, you wait a couple minutes, and then everything inside the GitOps repository will be installed in the Kubernetes cluster. In my case, it's just a simple application, and also it's creating a service, and the service provides me here with an external IP address. And when I call this IP address, I can see the Swagger UI of my very simple API. So as you can see, I was able to deploy my application without accessing the Kubernetes cluster. Then a couple sentences about the GitOps repository. This repository first contains a YAML file that contains information about the Helm chart, which we can see here. The interesting parts are the last 3 lines. So you have information in what Git repository Helm chart is located, then what branch should be used, and what the path to the Helm chart is. And then obviously you also have the Helm chart inside this GitOps repository. And the CD pipeline to start the deployment is, in my case, very simple. All it does it reads the newest tag from the Azure Container Registry via Azure CLI. Then it does a search and replace in the values.yaml file of the Helm chart, and then it commits the changes to the master branch. And once these changes are committed, the GitOps agent sees that something has changed, downloads them, and applies them to the Kubernetes cluster. And another great feature from Azure DevOps, and I also think from other platforms, is that you can provide parameter when you start a pipeline. In my case, I have the tag parameter, and if I provide a parameter, then the pipeline is using the provided tag, and if I don't provide a value, it will read the newest tag. So I'm flexible in what version I deploy. Another great extension is the Azure Key Vault extension, and what this extension does, it allows you to synchronize the secrets from the Azure Key Vault to your Kubernetes cluster. This is done via gRPC, And this gives you all the advantages of the Azure Key Vault. For example, secret rotation, access management, soft deletes, and so on. And also you can have your own pipeline, and this pipeline writes secrets into the Azure Key Vault, and that extension picks them up, synchronized to the Kubernetes cluster, and again, you update the secrets without having access to the Kubernetes cluster. And here you can see how this works. You just configure, or the extension to be more precise, configures Kubernetes to use the Azure Key Vault provider as a secret store, and therefore the developers don't have to change anything in the application code. And the next extension I want to talk about is the Azure Monitor extension. And what this extension does, it installs the Azure Monitor agent inside its own namespace. And once you have this agent running, it gathers information about the cluster and your container, and then sends this information to a log analytics workspace where you can use all the Azure tools such as Azure Monitor. And with Azure Monitor, you can create dashboards, you can create alerting. For example, if the CPU usage is too high, you want to alert someone, and you also have container insights. So you can see what's going on inside your container. And if you go to our Azure Arc instance, we have installed the Azure Monitor extension, and all the dashboards you see here come out of the box. So I didn't have to do anything, everything was provided by Microsoft and Azure. And if you take a closer look at the CPU utilization, we see that around 9:30, the CPU utilization suddenly went up to above 80%, and this triggered an alert, and so the support team could take a look, and at around 9:38 the problem was resolved, and the customers hopefully never felt any problems with the application. And here you can see an overview of the container insights, so we can see what's going on inside the container. And here you can see that the custom API had a very high usage. So this helps if you want to figure out which application is having problems or what's going on. So as I said before, we can have Azure Arc extensions, but we can also run full Azure services inside our Kubernetes cluster with Azure Arc. Before this, as I said, we can manage Azure Arc infrastructure. This is a so-called Azure Arc enabled server or Kubernetes, and we can also manage Azure Stack HCI. But what's way more interesting is the so-called Azure Arc enabled services, and what this allows us is to run Azure services for the first time outside of Azure. For example, you can use Azure App Services in your on-premise data center, or I can use an Azure API management and logic apps to run applications in your data center. But it doesn't stop there. There are also so-called data services, such as Azure SQL Managed Instance or Postgre and Azure Machine Learning. This allows you to keep your data on-premise, but still use Azure Services as said, the managed SQL instance. In this case, Microsoft takes care of installing the service, updating it, creating backups, providing load balancing, and so on. And you don't have to give the data to Microsoft. All it sends is some metadata, which is used for billing. For example, how many CPU cores are you using? And all the services run inside your Kubernetes cluster. So it's very important that you know Kubernetes because it's the base for almost everything. And then you can bring the services to your on-premise data center. And if I say on-premise data center, I also mean any other Kubernetes instance. For example, on Google's cloud service, the GKE, or on Amazon. And for the developers, it doesn't make any difference if it's running on Azure or on-premise. They can continue using the tools they are used to. And here we have an overview of everything I said today. So on the bottom, we have some infrastructure. For example, it could be Azure Stack HCI or VMware, but it could also be a different cloud provider such as Amazon or Google. Then you have Azure Arc that's managing all this infrastructure, and then you can bring Azure Services. Here we have some data services such the SQL Server and Postgres Server, but we also have here logic apps and app services. And then you can use even more services such as Azure Monitor or storage solutions. And over the last 2 years, I worked in several projects that used Azure Arc, and today I want to talk shortly about 2 projects. The first one is so-called Autonomous Ropeway System, and the second one is a Smart Machine Factory. So a ropeway system, we have them in Switzerland almost everywhere. In winter we use them for skiing, in summer we use them for hiking, and here you can see a ropeway system that's going up on a mountain, and this red box what you can see here is a so-called vehicle. And with the project Autonomous Ropeway System, we tried to make these vehicles or the whole system smart. So usually you have the problem that you have to figure out how many people you expect over during the day. So you have to get them out in the morning of the garage, put them on the ropeway, and if you put too many vehicles on the ropeway, you have a lot of wear and tear and energy usage, even though you don't have many visitors or customers. If you don't put enough vehicles on the ropeway, your visitor will have to wait a long time. And with our project, we try to automate this so that the ropeway vehicle comes automatically out of the garage if it's needed, and if it's not needed anymore, it goes back in the garage. And this is great for cost saving because you only need it, or you only use it when you need it. And this also allows you to run 24/7 because you don't have to have any employees who get them out of the garage or put them back into the garage. And another great feature is that this ropeway system is so smart that it can find its own way through a network. And this could lead to solutions where you have, for example, a ropeway system through a city, and you just say where you want to go, and the ropeway finds its way through the network and drops you off where you want to go. And the challenges we were facing, the first one was we had to use existing hardware because the customer already had the hardware and didn't want to spend any more money on cloud services or anything else. And we also had some network challenges. Especially we didn't have access to the firewall, and the firewall blocked every inbound traffic. This meant that we couldn't use Azure DevOps for the deployment, we couldn't use cloud services such as the Azure Monitor to know what's going on, we couldn't collect any logs from the Kubernetes cluster, and we were also not allowed to use any connections to Azure via VPN or ExpressRoute. And so we came up with an Azure Arc solution, and we implemented everything I told today. So we had the Git Ops extension for the deployment, we had the Azure Monitor extension for alerting and dashboards, and we also had the Key Vault extension to manage our secrets. And here you can see a picture of a station from the manufacturer, and there we could test our implementation. For me personally, this was a highlight because I was used to do online shops, and there you could just buy some stuff and nothing was really happening. But in this case, we clicked the button and suddenly the ropeway vehicle opened its door or started moving. So this was quite exciting. And the second project I'm working on right now, I can't say too much about it, but it's about a smart machine factory. So what my customer does is they sell machines which make machines. And the problem there is that these factories are often in areas where there's very bad infrastructure, such as in Africa or Asia. And also the customers have very high security requirements. So we couldn't use any cloud services because the internet connection is not reliable, and the customers didn't trust the cloud enough for their security reasons. And so we created Azure Stack HCI cluster and installed Azure Kubernetes service on there and shipped them to the customer factories. And the great thing with Azure Arc is that the Kubernetes cluster was managed by Microsoft, and we could also use, again, Azure services such as the monitor or the Git Ops for the deployment without having access to the Kubernetes cluster itself. And in this project, we also used additional services, for example, a managed PostgreSQL Server instance. Everything is managed by Microsoft, but we could easily use it and have all our data inside the Kubernetes cluster on-premise. So with this, my opinion about hybrid cloud. My opinion is that it is a very powerful tool because it can combine your on-premise infrastructure and requirements such as data security with the power of the cloud. And especially Azure Arc allows you to manage your infrastructure from the cloud. And this combines, again, the power of the cloud with the data never leaving your on-premise, and also this cost saving and the low latency. Then the problem with hybrid cloud is that you have to have a very deep technical knowledge about almost everything. For example, the examples I showed today, you have to know how Kubernetes works, you have to know how Git Ops works, some networking, some monitoring, and it gets complicated very quickly. And maybe another downside is that it's such a vast topic that I just can't even talk about all of it in this session today. Then my conclusion to Azure Arc, it's, in my opinion, the most powerful Azure service we have right now, and it's a major focus for Microsoft. So if you go to any conference from Microsoft, you will hear a lot about Azure Arc, and there are also new features coming, I think almost every week. But the problem is, again, you have to know a lot of technology, again, such as Kubernetes, networking, firewalls, DevOps, and so on. And since it's such a big service, it's also a bit buggy. So I had quite some problems with some of the services, and also the documentation is lagging a bit behind. The changes are coming in so fast that I feel that the documentation can't keep up. And with this, we're at the end of the session today. If you want to get the presentation, you can scan the QR code here on the right side, and I also provided you some links to a blog post of mine about Azure Arc. Then I have a couple YouTube videos and some documentation. And again, if you have any questions or want to contact me, you can reach me via my blog, LinkedIn, or Twitter. So feel free to message me. And with this, thank you for watching.